And I'll call to order the June 8th, 2020 special board meeting of the Monterey Peninsula Community College District Board of Trustees. Can we have a roll call, please?
I'm not hearing anything. Can they hear me?
No, they can't.
No,
Okay. No. Chair Anderson.
Here.
Vice Chair Steck.
Here.
Trustee Green.
Here.
Trustee Dunn Gustafson.
Here.
Trustee Johnson.
Here.
Student Trustee Mountain.
Here.
Thank you. Everybody is here.
Thank you. All right. If we could have birthday boy Trustee Rick Johnson lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, be awesome.
I'm coming. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Rick, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Appreciate you spending it with us.
Joreen sent me a wonderful note this morning, and I told her, I've had so many birthdays already, I feel gluttonous having another one. But unfortunately, spell check changed it into I feel glutinous.
Gluten is appropriate for a birthday.
I think so too.
And I'm hoping that Mr. Walker had some gluten on his birthday, which I failed to recognize at our last meeting. So happy belated birthday, Larry. Hope you had a good one. Hide behind that purple L or pink L. All right, so with that, we will move into item 1C, which is approval of the agenda. We only have one item on our agenda tonight. It's related to the bond. Do you have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion by Trustee Steck, second by Trustee Johnson. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Certainly. Chair Anderson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Steck.
Yes.
Trustee Green.
Yes.
Trustee Dunn Gustafson.
Here. Yes.
Trustee Johnson.
Yes.
Student Trustee Advisory Vote, Robert Mountain.
I saw Robert Mountain, yes, though we didn't hear you, Robert.
Yes.
Sure. So with that, we'll move into item number 2A on our agenda, public comment. Is there anyone who would like to make a comment on an item not on the agenda this evening, but within the purview of the Board of Trustees? You can raise your little blue hand, or I believe press *9 if you're on the phone to do so. All right, being none, we will go ahead and close public comment and move right into new business, item 3A, which is an action to authorize staff to start building consensus for potential November 2020 bond. And I'll just, before handing it off to Interim Superintendent President Martin, I'll just say, following the last meeting, it felt like looking at what we're going to be dealing with in June at our June board meeting, and just wanting to keep the conversation fresh and flowing after our last one, that it seemed appropriate to go ahead and have a special meeting just to talk about this particular item tonight and be able to give staff some direction, since there is, a timing aspect to it. So David, if you want to key everybody, get us all on the same page so the board can engage in discussion, that'd be great.
Sure, and thank you very much, Chair Anderson, for the opportunity to address the board this evening.
Ultimately, at the last board meeting, True North presented the results of their feasibility study, and in referencing the last page of their PowerPoint, it identified a 4-step process to the pursuit of a potential November 2020 bond election. And after the feasibility study is completed, ultimately the next stage in the process is to start building consensus. And what building consensus is that it directs staff to go out into the community and start talking with community groups, community organizations, start asking questions about different types of projects, start providing information, and start answering questions, and really engaging in those community conversations about the potential of a November 2020 ballot election. Another part of the consensus building stage is to start drafting resolution language for potential consideration down the line. Also identifying specific projects that we may want to pursue, we may not want to pursue. Really taking a list of projects out to the community and asking for their feedback, for their input, and really having a conversation not only with community members, but with community organizations, community leaders, and community partners to get an idea as to what their needs are and to how we can crosswalk our project list with the needs of our community. And that's really done in the building consensus stage. At this point in time, we're not out in the community seeking any type of yes or no vote. We're not out looking for any type of commitment for a potential November ballot election. We are at this point in time asking for the board's direction to go out into the community with a list of projects and start having conversations with community leaders and community organizations as to potential projects and answering any questions that they may have. At this point in time, we are really just looking for authorization to engage the community based on the results of the feasibility study, which indicated that there is a potential likelihood of a successful campaign. So we are asking the board for their direction and their approval to enter into step number 2, or the consensus building stage. Real quickly, just to conclude that this stage or this meeting does not authorize a November ballot election. As discussed previously, the board has until August 7th and will need to take an official formal vote to finalize any November ballot election. So this evening's vote or this evening's action item does not officially put anything on the ballot. It does not direct staff to go out and seek yes votes. It really provides staff the direction to go out and start engaging in conversations throughout the entire Monterey County. So that's really what the action item on the agenda is this evening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Any questions from board members? Yeah, Marilyn?
Unmute. Okay. I guess at what stage in this process will we as the board have a proposal from the campaign consultant as to how they would stage the campaign, the different aspects and components of the campaign? When will that come in this process?
That would come into this process towards the middle and late part of July, ultimately to be a part of the consideration for an August 7th formal action as to whether or not to proceed. Okay. Ultimately, the consensus building stage over the next month, month and a half really helps us identify what are some of the specific projects or what are some of the specific information components that we would want to include in a potential marketing campaign. So we hope to spend the next month, month and a half out in our community to help us put together the pieces of what will eventually become a formalized marketing campaign that will be presented to the board in the middle to late parts of July, prior to consideration of a formal action on or before August 7th.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify though, a marketing campaign for the bond is something that needs to happen outside of and its district resources. So David, are you speaking towards the actual campaign should the board elect to with a bond, or are you speaking towards general communications about MPC and role in the community that would be happening in a consensus building stage? And I guess also, Marilyn, which were you asking about?
I'm very well aware that the college and we as trustees will not be using college time to talk about a campaign in support of a political position. So I do understand that. However, the campaign is critical. So I guess I have forgotten who approved the strategies of the campaign when we did the last one. Because I was very intimately involved, but I worked for the foundation and that was independent of the college, so I could do that. But I didn't work with any of the trustees. The trustees helped, but outside of their normal business activities as trustees. I don't remember.
So you were specifically asking
so I'm not
about,
sure.
You were asking about at the point a bond would be being pursued, which is further down the road than we are talking about this evening.
Exactly. I know that. I was just wondering at what stage.
Okay.
And if I may add a little bit to that, and thank you very much for the question and the conversation, because I think one of the components of the next month, month and a half is to really identify what the community's interests are, which gives us a potential roadmap on developing a potential marketing plan if the board decides to take formal action on or before August 7th. So it's really the legwork and the outreach and the informational gathering phase starts now, and ultimately if the vote is taken to make it official on or before August 7th, the marketing campaign that will eventually come afterwards, funded and completely performed outside of college working hours and college funding, that campaign will rely and use the information that is being gathered at this point in time during the consensus stage. So it's really a building block over the next month to eventually potentially lead to a marketing campaign if the board so chooses to take official action to put us on the November ballot.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? No questions? Oh, looks like Robert has a question, but I saw Robert moving his mouth, but I don't know if maybe he can't unmute himself.
I was going to say that Robert actually sent us an email with a number of very good questions. I was hoping he would bring them up now.
Can someone unmute Robert, please? I'm not a host of the meeting, Robert, otherwise I'd unmute me myself. There you go, you're live now. Robert, we should be able to hear you now.
I know. There we go. Yeah. So I did have some questions about how to interpret the report. First of all, with regard to the amount of risk involved, and particularly with respect to the recent series of bond issues that were put to the voters in March throughout the state of California. And since David has had a chance to study this report much more carefully, I think, than we have, and probably interacted with the consultants at a deeper level than we had an opportunity to, I'd hope he could give us his thinking on this, both in terms of what the board actually, what the report actually says in terms of risk, and what we can learn from the results of the March bond issue results.
Sure, I can jump in and try to respond to the best of my ability in regards to the analysis of the True North polling presentation. Ultimately, the question of risk, in my opinion, is very subjective in the sense that risk is relative to several different factors. I think anytime any district pursues a ballot campaign, there is a certain level of risk that that ballot campaign will be unsuccessful, whether it's for a Prop 39 bond or whether it's for other ballot initiatives. There's always that element of risk to where the campaign will be unsuccessful. Some of the factors that we look to really utilize the next month or two is really determining what that risk is. It's getting out into the community and speaking with our community members, engaging with campus groups, engaging with community groups, engaging with industry leaders to determine what their needs are and how they can see us partnering and potentially building a successful bond project list that not only meets the needs of our campus, but meets the needs of our community. So in regards to the level of risk, Student Trustee Mountain, I completely agree that anytime any ballot campaign is put on an election item, there's a level of risk there. But ultimately at this point in time, it's very hard to identify or specify with any level of certainty as to what that risk is, because ultimately we're still in the very early stages of the process.
Well, but we can look at the environment and we can contrast the environment, both the political and economic environment as we find it now with, say, the environment 5 months before the March bond issue.
Sure.
5 months before the March bond issue, the economy was moving along. There was no hint of
Sure.
COVID. There was modest amounts of social unrest, but I would say nothing compared to what we've been experiencing. And there's a difference in the environment, and there's obviously a difference in risk. And the consultants identified many of those elements of risk. In addition, I think there's, strategic risks. In addition to the one that I mentioned, they also mentioned the local risk of a highly conflicted series of anti-tax measures and the local initiatives to that. All of that suggests this is going to be a heavy lift. To that, I would add some tactical issues. The issue of bringing the campus together, getting the students behind this while they're, taking classes online, the difficulty in addressing live meetings, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are all significant tactical issues, which I think should give us pause to say, okay, is is this the time to move forward on a bond issue, or would it be imprudent? And again, I look to you, David, for guidance on this. You understand, I'm sure, and have thought about the pluses and minuses of the risks and rewards of this kind of thing.
Sure.
I don't think we can just say, well, any bond issue is a risk, because this isn't any bond issue. This is a bond issue taken under very turbulent conditions, and I think we need to recognize what those differences are. I keep on returning to the March experience, because I think we can learn from that. Most of those were defeated, and yet some of them were successful. And I think we perhaps need to look at those bond issues kind of carefully and see what we can learn from them. I suspect that our consultants had a hand in some of those bond issues, and it would be interesting to know what their experiences and their insights are.
So, sorry, raise my hand, but it doesn't. I see what we're talking about tonight as the way to measure that risk, because I was personally surprised by the results that came back and the being so favorable. But I have faith in that True North did on our behalf, and was very thoughtful, and it's a tested process. And I feel that the next step is for us to go out and actually do some bellwethers with community members and community leaders who we're gonna need in our corner if we decide to move forward in this process. We're gonna need to be championing this bond on our behalf. So my internet connection is unstable, so Dr. Stack, be on standby. And so for me, that's where I say, okay, we do need to move into the consensus building stage, because that's where we go out and we check the data with what is actually sitting in people's guts locally. And it's not, and then we get the chance as a board to make a decision later after we've trued up the data with actual experience. Dr. Stack.
So I think you're both exactly right. I think this will be a difficult campaign. Just to amplify what Robert said, last year, well, the Prop 39 was passed in the year 2000. So there's about 20 years now of bonds that have been presented to voters since the creation of Prop 39. In that time, there have been thousands of bond issues that have gone before the voters for education bonds. In all that time, the average pass rate until March was 84%. So although there's always a risk, the risk was fairly low for all of those years from 2000 to 2020. And as Robert pointed out, the pass rate in March, there were 119, I think, 119 bond issues, Prop 39 bond issues that were on the ballot in March this past year, a couple months ago. And the pass rate there was 36%. That's about a 50-point drop relative to what it was just from the year 2000 until then. So that's a huge drop. It's also the case, as we remember, that the Prop 13 that was on the ballot in March, which was a very unfortunately named school bond election, essentially, a statewide bond issue, also lost. It gathered about 47% of the vote, and it needed 51 to pass. But that's the first time in 20 years that an education bond issue has failed at the state level. Now, we were told that that might have been a crazy anomaly, that what happened in March was people were they were preoccupied by the Trump impeachment. The market had dropped about 1,300 points by March 3rd, which was the date of the election relative to its peak a couple weeks earlier. So things, they have good excuses that, I don't want to call them excuses in a pejorative sense, but good potential reasons which might have called in, that may have made that a highly anomalous time. But, you know, we, in California, a lot of people vote absentee, and that probably means they vote a month early. So it's probably the case that a lot of the votes that came in, which were not favorable to bond issues, came in long before the March 3rd deadline and before COVID, and all the unrest that happened after it. So those are the bad things that tell me. Oh, and one more thing, and that is although we were told that the results are very favorable, I'm not as sure that they are as very favorable as we might have been led to believe. We got 20 some odd percent who were strongly in favor and 30 some odd percent, for a total of 62, who were moderately favorable toward it. And if you add those numbers up, that adds to 62 or 61 or 64, depending upon which question you ask or which one you look at. But that kind of presupposes that you get everybody who says they're going to vote for you, and you also get everybody who says probably they'll vote for you. And I think that it's probably prudent to not expect everybody who says probably is actually going to vote for you. So I think there's a risk. There's a real risk, and the risk is greater than we might have thought if we had been on the ballot earlier. Of course, if we were on the ballot in March, things might have looked great, and we probably would have lost. So that's all on the one side. And on the other side, there is the fact that we kind of need a bond issue. We need a bond issue to do the things that we promised the voters we would accomplish with the last bond issue that we were unable to do. And I think it is a great risk. A couple of years ago, we considered a bond issue, and I think that was not the right time to do a bond issue. It may not be the right time to do a bond issue this time either, but it's not the right time for fundamentally different reasons if it is not the right time. And in some sense, I also understand that you can't be afraid of asking the voters for their opinion. It'll be a tough battle. I think this one will be a much tougher battle than we would have thought we would have had to have done just a few months ago. But I think if we don't do it, we can't do it again for 2 years or 4 years. That's a long time for us to not meet the needs that we know exist currently. So I'm torn between these. I agree that's a tough lift, but for the time being, as Yuri just stated, this isn't the time we're asking for a vote to go ahead. This is a time whether we want to stop now or do we want to continue to see what the reality is out there. And I'm not sure I know what the reality is out there. So I'm not sure this is the right time to stop it entirely. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Rick, Trustee Johnson.
Thank you, Yuri. Yeah, I think we are now, a number of things that Robert said made a lot of sense to me. Certainly everything Yuri and Lauren at the end said makes sense to me. But we're not here tonight to really debate the bond issue. It's if we want to go into the community and get their feelings. And at this point, I honestly don't know what the community will say, but let's not make a decision without getting their input. This conversation is critical. If we do decide to go ahead, and if we decide not to, it'll be because of the information that we garnered from the community. So I think we need to pull this back just a little and remember why we're doing this tonight and not necessarily go down the line of trying to kill it without that information. Okay?
Go ahead, Robert, you got your hand up. Robert?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one last thing, and that was in the arguments against the bond, the negative results. If you add up the arguments that the respondents were strongly in favor of, those, yes, that's right. You know, they seem to find those first 2 or 3 arguments also quite persuasive, and you know, that adds to the risk, it seems to me. I did also ask about the costs, because I think I think what we will need to do is weigh not just the risks, but also the costs involved. And I would like to understand where in the budget the money to support this bond issue will come from, and what I see a 0 from Maryland, and what and what we will have to give up, you know, to spend that, say, $400,000 on the bond. Marilyn, if you know, I'd be happy to hear that.
I'm going to go ahead and ask Superintendent
I'm not-
President Martin or Steve to answer that question.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you for that opportunity. And initially, the cost to go on the election or go on the ballot will not be substantial to the district, because 2 months ago at the board's regular meeting, they approved 4 trustee seats to be on the election. So ultimately, the bond ballot language will be accompanied with the 4 trustee seats that will accompany the total election cost. So in regards to going onto the ballot, it won't be a significant cost at all, only the cost of printing the materials, which will be trivial expense. But ultimately, if the board decides to approve the bond language to be placed on the ballot, then ultimately that starts a campaign that is done outside the scope of the district's funds, and ultimately will require fundraising and the use of sources that are not of public funds. So we will ultimately not be able to use any district funds in pursuit of the marketing campaign that will potentially help us be successful in November.
Now that's different from what the consultant said at the last meeting. Do you recall their response?
I do, and I think that the consultant wasn't aware that we already had committed to placing the cost of 4 trustee seats on the ballot for the November election. If we were going into an election cycle to where we had no trustee seats up for election, we would then have to pay an amount per registered voter in our county in order to run the cost of an election. But because that cost to run an election for MPC is already included significantly in the trustee component, then ultimately placing the bond on top of that is not a significant dollar amount.
Okay, well, that's good news. And then the other part of the expense, you know, the marketing, the advertising, et cetera, which could be $200,000 to $300,000, I think. Where will that come from?
And that'll come from a variety of sources. I think at this point, it's very premature to tell, but in speaking in very broad brushstrokes, how districts have done it throughout the state, they seek private donations and they seek funding from external sources who are interested in, you know, the potential of the district being successful in the bond. So it is really a fundraising campaign which ultimately reaches out to a variety of groups and a variety of companies and industries seeking donations to help support the marketing efforts. So there's no one specific source. It is truly a fundraising campaign that covers a wide variety of organizations and individuals as well.
We know one source that it is not is district funds.
So we're not talking about rating the MPC Foundation.
The MPC Foundation is a separate 501c3, so ultimately is not public funds or part of the district's public funds books and records. So it is a separate legal entity.
So are we talking about rating it or not?
We aren't talking about anything because there would be a separate committee or whatnot that would be developing the budget for any sort of campaign as well as the sources of those, is what I hear.
Well, I just want to say that I agree with everything that's been said, particularly Trustee Johnson. I agree that we ought to move forward. I think we ought to keep in mind that this is shaping up to be a very risky proposition. And I think we need to know at what point in this process we're going to weigh all of this and put all the information together and make a careful, reasoned decision. Would that be at the board meeting immediately before the August 7th, or so I guess the last board meeting in July?
That would be our last officially scheduled opportunity unless we felt we needed to have some sort of special meeting to do so. I see that, Marilyn, you have your hand up. Did you want to make a comment or ask a question? You're on mute, my darling.
Robert, I appreciate your questions and I appreciate your interest. I don't appreciate your terminology in alluding to the fact that we might raid the foundation of our college. Number one, that's not our prerogative at all. And number two, separate fundraising will go on, and to determine that when the time is right. There are several of us on the board who considered doing a bond election. Was it 2 years ago or 4 years ago, Lauren?
Well, that's a good question.
Time goes
Probably,
by quickly.
let's compromise for 3 years. Let's say 3.
Well, there was we considered putting a ballot measure on for a bond, Robert. And at that time, we decided that we didn't have enough consensus to do that. It wasn't that there weren't identified projects. And I have to say that our first responders have been right with us in wanting us to move this forward because they want to see that property at Fort Ord developed. And we have to be very well aware that in order to develop that property and in order to build the type of I don't want to say facility because it's not necessarily a bricks and mortar building, but what all of the infrastructure that would be needed for that was promoted by a recent grand jury report that chided us at MPC for not moving it forward years before. So I want you to know that this has been rather at the front of our minds for many years. It's
Good.
not a hasty decision at all.
Right.
Trustee Johnson?
Yeah,
Well,
thank you. I think I want to warn myself and everybody else. There's some really good questions here. And Rick Hoyer had sent me some too that I had sent on to David. But I think right now today, this is important that we actually not debate this at this moment, but that we keep our minds open and actually see what input we get from the community, or we're gonna paint ourselves, and I'm including myself in this, we're gonna paint ourselves into corners where we've already made up our mind. And I think it's very premature for the board to make up its mind quite yet. So I don't know if this is gonna take a motion or what. If it is, I'd like to make a motion that it does?
Well, it is listed as an action item to do that, but I would actually like to see if there are any members of the public that would like to make a comment before we entertain a motion. So I
At
see
which
Rick.
point I would like not to make a motion. Thank you.
I see Rick. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Hauer with the hand up. If someone could
Hoyer.
Hoyer, thank you.
Yes.
Unmute Rick.
Greetings all, my name is Rick Hoyer, President of the Monterey Peninsula Taxpayers Association, and got a little bit of input for you all. First, if you're looking at going out for community support and information, great. The question becomes, can you all hear me?
Mhm.
The question is, what is the budget you're committing to do that? Staff time is not free, and any time spent going out into the community, talking to folks and other resources, what is the budget that you're putting aside to do that? Second thing is when you're going out and talking to the community, make sure you talk to the whole community, not just known past supporters and those who are going to echo your own potential views. We, as an organization, we'd be more than happy to meet with you all to discuss it and find out more. We do that with any organization in advance, and the only time we've ever supported as bonds is when we have had those conversations and when concerns we've raised are potentially taken into account. There's a number of different things. I think Trustee Mountain is very valid in his concerns. This November is a unique election cycle that has never been seen in the state. You're dealing with unique scenarios from COVID, from very polarized, everything under the sun. In addition, you have split roll on the ballot. Prop 13 failed earlier this year, and there was no organized opposition on a local basis against that, but yet it failed. I can tell you right now, split roll has galvanized multiple organizations who will be exceedingly involved this fall if it remains on the ballot opposing it. And it's just a small step to add them into opposing any other bond measure as well. Yes, there's been a long history in the past of a lot of Prop 39 bonds passing. The thing you need to be careful of is twofold. Number one, most of those bonds, or a large percentage, were the first bonds for that district or that organization in many, many, many years to address a wide range of years of neglect and to do it. Your bond is not the first bond. We're still paying on the existing one. So a lot of what was done with that wasn't done with that, and the whole cost factor is very different. The other thing is, I don't think there's been a single school-related bond that ever failed that didn't have a survey that told them it most likely was going to pass. And as indicated before, as Mr. Stex indicated, maybe voting for or probably is not definite. Anyone in that group can be converted with the right arguments, and even the survey itself said there were a lot of arguments. So I think there needs to be a discussion. If you are leaning towards doing it, you most definitely do need to get community input, but make sure it is true community input.
Thank you, Mr. Hauer. That's your 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public that would like to make a comment? All right, seeing none. Before I take it to the board to for an action, Robert, I'll get to you just after I make my comment.
Sure.
We were fortunate in being able to schedule this meeting tonight, but I feel that if the direction of the board is to move into the consensus building stage, it would be helpful if we have some sort of ad hoc, provide a nimble feedback between the board and what the staff is doing around consensus building. And so if we do move forward, I'd like us to consider that as an option for making sure that in this very compacted time frame that we're giving our staff the resources and time they need from our board to be as informed as possible. So just think about that as you make your motion, because you may get called upon to serve on an ad hoc committee. So Student Trustee Mountain.
So I just wanted to apologize to Marilyn. I appreciate the sensitivity of the Carmel Foundation to given your long investment in it, and
MPC Foundation.
And I just simply raised that not to suggest it, but when I was having this explained to me offline, it was explained that the marketing part could not be done with college funds, and it would be done with outside funds, probably the MPC Foundation, and that's why and that raised hackles, because the Monterey Foundation plays a hugely important role for students. And so my point in asking about that is to make sure that it wasn't going to be unduly tapped. So, but I know that you're sensitive, and I should have been a little less cavalier in raising that. And I also appreciate the history that you gave of previous efforts. And I feel that we're all on board. We know that this is a serious issue, that we need to look at it carefully. And I guess Mr. Hoyer did ask a question that he needs to have an answer to, which is the funding of the efforts to go out and tap the community.
That is certainly, that's a question that we could address in a future discussion, but we aren't actually supposed to respond to questions from the public in this setting.
That's fine.
You're laughing at me, Lauren. All right, so if there's no more,
so I was going to say, yeah, sorry.
If there's no more questions or comments from the board, the action before us is to authorize staff to start building consensus or move into the consensus building phase for a potential November 2020 bond. And I would add and form an ad hoc committee to provide input and support to the staff in doing that. So I'll make that motion if there is a second on the table. Or
I will second it.
Okay.
All right. So
Good choice.
Motion by Anderson, second by Mr. Johnson. And can I ask Mr. Johnson and Trustee Green if they would be willing to serve on that ad hoc committee? Just thinking about the connections that Rick has in the Monterey area, and knowing that it's going to be a heavy lift in Trustee Area 1 and anywhere around this. We want to make sure we're tapping into those communities as well as we think about who we are seeking input from. So can I get a nod from Mr. Johnson on his birthday? Okay. All right, so the motion on the table is to authorize staff to move into the consensus building phase for a potential November 2020 ballot and form an ad hoc committee consisting of Trustee Johnson and Trustee Green to support them in that process. There's a motion and a second, and can we have a roll call vote, please?
Certainly. Chair Anderson?
Aye.
Vice Chair Stack?
Yes.
Trustee Green?
Aye.
Trustee Dunn-Gustafson?
Aye.
Trustee Johnson?
Aye.
Student Trustee Advisory vote, Robert Mountain.
Aye.
That is unanimous.
Great, awesome. So thank you for coming together for this special meeting, and thank you, Rick and Rosalind, for being willing to get additional calls from David and team as they kick it into high gear over the next 8 weeks or so to bring something back for this board to consider towards the end of July. Before we adjourn the meeting, I just want to remind all of us board members about our rules around Brown Act communications and not communicating with each other about issues and business of the district. We don't want to be violating and doing business outside of the view of the public. So we can direct those questions or comments to the superintendent president, and then he can share answers in a one-way direction with the board for appropriate topics. So just we all do it, or is it easy? There's a lot of rules around it. So, all right. So if there's nothing else for the good of the order, we will adjourn this meeting at 5:22 p.m. and wish everyone a happy week, and to see you later this month.
Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you. Good night.